When it comes to film, horror and sex go together like wine and cheese. Admittedly, a very gross wine and a very sexually confusing cheese, but I don't know, maybe that metaphor doesn't work. But it is the case that horror films and sex are joined at the hip. From the squeaky antics of I Spit on Your Grave and Antichrist to the decidedly less eye-bleachy TNA of The Hunger or 1992's Dracula, horror and sex are inseparable in cinema, to the point at which it's even become a trope to make fun of.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
But something I've noticed about the horror canon, that is your core stable of films that any horror fan worth their salt will have seen. So your Freddys, your Jasons, Alien, The Love Guru, is that mainstream horror has a surprisingly limited view of sex and sexuality. For a genre that's been trafficked by weirdo Italian auteurs and rebellious punks for decades, there aren't a lot of popular horror films that set their sights beyond the missionary position. I think that's kinda disappointing. So in this video, in honour of the great spooky month that is October, I'm going to look at one of the outliers. A horror film that's, for lack of a better term, surprisingly kinky. Clive Barker's Hellraiser.
I have seen the future of horror. His name is Clive Barker.
I've spent most of my life watching horror films, and a lot of that time has boiled down to standing in the horror aisle of video stores, exchanging glances with this guy. Now, I consider myself a horror fan, but Hellraiser has always been one of my blind spots, and so I always looked at this image and wondered, who is that guy? What's he all about? Is he measured and sadistic like Michael Myers? Wry and goofy like Freddy? Or is he bitter and angry because his barber gave him the Kaplunk special? Well, last week I finally watched Hellraiser for the first time, and I can confirm after all of these years that he isn't wry or goofy or angry, he isn't a slasher or a psycho, he's kinky. That's his thing. And not just a little bit either, his whole deal is that he's kinky. The kind of kinky that makes teens blush and mothers cry. I'm aware that this won't come as a shock to anyone who's familiar with Barker's work, but Hellraiser is kinky in a way that I really didn't expect. And in many ways, it's a film that perfectly exemplifies the weird marriage between horror and sex. But let's get the basics out of the way. Released in 1987, Hellraiser is a small-scale story, so focused around a core set of characters and their interpersonal relationships that it could easily pass as a stage play. Written and directed by Barker, at that point a plucky enfant terrible in the world of horror fiction, it's a film that revolves around a stodgy British couple moving into an old family home and coming to terms with the dark secrets hidden within. The film opens on Frank Cotton, bad boy deviant and walk-in Head and Shoulders advert, buying a mysterious box in a Moroccan market. Frank has been experimenting with the decadent world of BDSM, and this box is his next big experiment. It's sold as a portal to a realm of bodily pleasures, which, in this case, seems to mean having your unmentionables strung up on hooks in your attic and getting carted off to a hell dimension. To each their own. The bulk of the film follows the fallout of Frank's sexual misadventure after Larry and Julia, his brother and sister-in-law, move into the house where he died. Let's get this out of the way. This film is obsessed with sex, and so we're very quickly given the top trumps ratings on all of these characters' sex lives. Larry, for example, is a complete sexual bore, the epitome of that very British, stiff-upper-lip sexlessness, in stark contrast to Frank, who he repeatedly characterises as a criminal, despite the fact that most of his indiscretions seem to boil down to rampant boinking. Julia, on the other hand, is actually a secret deviant, in large part because of an affair she had with Frank back in the day, before he became rotisserie. Thanks to an accidental blood ritual, Frank is brought back from the BDSM dimension looking a little worse for wear. He needs blood to rejuvenate his old body, and so from the attic he rekindles his affair with Julia, and unbeknownst to Larry, the two of them set about preying on all of the hot singles in your area, with the end goal of eloping together. If it wasn't already apparent, Hellraiser is a very bodily film. It's a film that appeals to the primal, Cro-Magnon parts of your brain, trading in lust, fear, and all those other basic emotions that prove themselves upon our pulses. Fluids are shot in slow motion and come out thick and sloshy like spilled cough syrup, while mouths and bodies slap together like limp cuts of ham. And it's all shot in super unflinching detail, to the point at which sometimes you can't tell if you're looking at a vicious murder scene or the inside of a can of kidney beans. And at the front of it all are the Cenobites, extra-dimensional kinksters who live to extract pleasure from pain, touring across the folds of space and time like an S&M boy band. The Cenobites use the box that Frank bought back in Morocco as a form of contract, by which they invite only the most die-hard of S&M addicts to their personal hell dimension. If you solve the box's puzzle, you're effectively signing a cosmic dotted line to have your body whisked away and used and abused. In Frank's case though, it's clear that he bit off a bit more than he could chew, assuming he was even still capable of chewing looking like this. Anyway, unluckily for everyone involved, when Frank escaped the kink dimension, he brought the box back with him. And so in the midst of Frank and Julia's killing spree, things come to a head as the Cenobites arrive on Earth looking to reclaim the box and its owner. So far you might be thinking, hey, this doesn't sound kinky, this actually sounds kind of horrifying. But what's interesting about the Cenobites is that the film doesn't make too many ethical judgments against them.
Who are you?
Explorers in the further regions of experience, demons to some, angels to others.
Their morality is based around the pursuit of pain and pleasure. They don't claim to be from heaven or hell, because what they offer isn't as simple as good pleasure or bad pain, but that interesting middle ground where the two can cross over. And it's suggested that, Frank aside, there are people out there who do find their services desirable.
This better not awaken anything in me.
And on top of that, for horror movie monstrosities, they're actually kind of upstanding. There's a point in the film where a character solves the box by accident, and the lead Cenobite, Mr. Kinky here, doesn't really seem to understand why they wouldn't want their giblets torn up. And yeah, he does handle the situation a little poorly.
We'll tear your soul apart.
But I don't think he approaches it any worse than your average call center employee. In stealing the box and bringing it back to Earth, Frank has clearly upset their order. He genuinely can't understand how someone could get hold of the box without knowing exactly what they were in for. Horrifying though they may be, the Cenobites are providing a service to those who deeply desire it. And so they come to represent a distressing but ultimately neutral force, the extreme face of sadomasochistic desire.
This is it.
Let me
No,
see.
don't touch it. It's dangerous. It opens doors.
What kind of doors?
Doors to the pleasures of heaven or hell. I didn't care which.
So you've got a film about someone who might have gone too far indulging himself in his kinks. Actually, let's be honest, he's definitely gone too far. But then on the other end, you've got the opposite. A woman with a libido like an unexploded ordnance, so sexually unfulfilled that she's murderous with desire. And what's interesting is that within this dynamic, Kink and the gang here aren't actually the dangerous ones. They have a code of conduct, they have rules. Admittedly, I don't think the puzzle-solving contract would hold up in a court of law, and their approach to consent is a little bit 20th century, but at least they have a sense of reason to them. These guys, though, the deviant and the unfulfilled housewife, are the actual murderous villains. In the middle of all of this carnage is the film's closest thing to an audience surrogate, KIRSTY. She's Larry's daughter, and I like to think she represents a balanced middle ground between Frank and Julia. In an inversion from your typical tropey horror film, she isn't pure. She spends half of the film making kissy lips at her new boyfriend, but she also isn't enticed by the dubious pleasures of the box. KIRSTY acts as the moral guide for the viewer, someone who draws the line at the film's clear extremities, but isn't necessarily turned off by the fantasies underneath. She's still sexual, but in a way that doesn't cause her to sign pacts with demons or bludgeon middle-aged men in an attic. The main message of Hellraiser, as I see it, is that all of this could have been avoided if everyone could just get naughty and do their thing.
How long since you were here?
Oh, the better part of 10 years. I wanted to sell it after the old lady died. I couldn't get Frank to agree. I guess he needed a hideout or something.
Frank has been criminalized for his preferences. He turned to the box because he had no options elsewhere, while Julia turned to murder because she was so sick of the missionary position. Kirsty and the Cenobites are the model for success. They've each been afforded the space to practice their desires, and as a result, spoiler alert for a 30-year-old film, they are the survivors. Hellraiser is a real chin-stroker because despite indulging so deeply in the visual language of monsters, the scariest thing is actually just some humans who haven't been given an opportunity to get their rocks off properly. There are plenty of theories floating around out there as to why sex and horror combine so often in films. One of my favourite theories is material. It suggests that horror and pornography have too much in common not to stick together. From government investigations to protests outside theatres, the ghettoization of both violence and sex in Western culture may have actually pushed them together as strange bedfellows. And in Hellraiser, we kind of see a version of this. In Frank, you've almost got a parable about how sex and horror have been forced together by their shared repression. Frank is the edgy outcast, shunned for his proclivities, and in his brother Larry, the film shows us an acceptable image of Britain so boring and sexless that you understand why Frank's only option to get his kicks was to buy second-hand satanic goods on the black market. Pardon the pun, but Frank was boxed into his situation. Society pushed him away because of his sexual preferences. It labelled him dangerous, and so he became dangerous.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Well, that's nice to know.
I think there's a lot of Frank in Clive Barker. Not so much in the sense that he's a homicidal skeleton man, but back in the 80s, Barker developed a reputation as a provocateur and a boundary pusher, and it's all there in Hellraiser. For a film released only 4 years after the commotion surrounding video nasties and Merry Whitehouse, it seems to revel in bad taste. The gore is gratuitous, and the sex is unashamedly steamy and drawn out. And I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the film's biggest jump scares is performed by a statue of Jesus. It's blasphemous and gross and naughty, and it knows it. Hellraiser, like a lot of horror films of the time, is confrontational. A lot of its images weren't necessary to the plot or tone, but were put there precisely because they would elicit a negative reaction.
Get out. You get out of here.
Something I learned about Clive Barker is that he was known to attend leather bars and BDSM nights when he was younger, and he openly admits that his experiences in those circles informed the design of the Cenobites. He's become increasingly frank about his sexuality in recent years, both as a gay man and a former sex worker, and I have to wonder to what extent the extremities of his fiction have been influenced by the ways in which the identities of queer men, sex workers, and sadomasochists have all historically been conflated with violence, debauchery, and criminality. As a film, Hellraiser is kind of a puzzle box unto itself. Just as Frank was pushed into that black market bazaar in order to feel out his fetishes, you do have to wonder if Barker was pushed into the black market of sex and violence to tell a story exploring his own interests. The film is a confrontational collage of sex, leather, and gore, but it's all deeply rooted in ideas about sexuality and what happens when people aren't allowed to express their desires safely.
He's my father, and you can't have him. No!
One of the scenes that made me want to make this video is when, just after killing her first victim, Julia retreats to the bathroom. She's breathless, her lips are smeared with lipstick, her face is bloody, and she chooses to wipe off the lipstick first. For Julia, driven by her lust for Frank, blood is now sexual. It represents a form of freedom, the world of naughty sex scenes shot in soft focus. The lipstick, on the other hand, is shameful. It represents normalcy, the world of Larry and all the other white-collar workers she lures back to the attic, who are so sexually inexpressive that she feels content in killing them for it. The confrontational message at the forefront of Hellraiser is that pleasure can extend far beyond the world of lipstick. There are people out there in the real world who might seem like Cenobites to me or you, people so immersed in the primal world of sadomasochism that their pain might seem horrific, but who live immeasurably pleasurable lives. but there are also people who look normal who maybe need a little bit more Cenobite in them. Julia is almost a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't have a safe space to get weird with it. She's so steeped in the drab society of 1980s Britain that when she finally gets a chance to let loose, it's all too much too fast. A life of superficial pleasures gives way to a torrent of real pain.
See.
I'm kind of glad that I held off on watching Hellraiser for so long. I don't think I would have appreciated it all that much when I was younger and more reactionary. There's a link between horror and sex here that's a lot more complex than in a lot of the slasher films I grew up watching. The Cenobites are decked to the nines in kinky drip. They live to terrify and satisfy, and the film doesn't condemn them for it. These guys are just some kinky loose cannons in the wrong place, the wrong time. In a pre-50 Shades world, unless you're willing to don your Sunday best gimp suit and take a trip to your nearest sex shop or fetish market, it was hard to find films that were this unashamed about the kinkier side of life. As I think about it more, I realise that Larry is the ultimate villain of the piece, for casting such a restrictive net over both Frank and Julia. He's the face of the man, the boring stiff who won't allow people to get freaky. And in the world of Hellraiser, the worst thing is to be sexually unfulfilled. Unless you're an absolute psycho, I don't think this film is going to make you weak at the knees anytime soon, but it is very kinky. In its own twisted way, Hellraiser celebrates the bodily worlds of both sex and violence, and that perverse meeting point between the two that seems to tickle the fancy of a certain subset of the population. It's a film that recognises that the lines between pain and pleasure aren't always that clear-cut. So, wine and cheese, booze and dairy, whatever awkward metaphor you use to frame it, sex and horror go hand in hand. And Hellraiser is a smart, surprisingly kinky film that demonstrates just why.